In many ways, a discussion about writing is a discussion about language. To tell a good story, you have to figure out what you want to say and how best to say it to convey the emotions and elicit the reactions you're going for. Will you be using plain or so-called purple prose? What kind of language will you be using? Manners of speaking get grouped into different registers corresponding to their level of formality. Are you better served by a high register, or would something informal get the point across? This carries over into character voice. How they choose to speak can tell us about them the same way prose can set a tone for a story. But beyond even these technical choices, when writing, the choices made in world building have an effect as well. Words and word usage unique to a fictional world are a great tool for adding depth and building authenticity. When trying to add unique language to a world deliberately, it's easy to go overboard. Many fantasy stories find themselves bogged down giving magical sounding names to everything and then needing to explain them. Sci-fi can get caught up in technobabble or piles of jargon. And of course there's the option of full-on conlangs. But before embarking on a huge project like that, it's worth considering all the ways in which a lighter touch can achieve great rewards. Jargon is defined as technical or specialized terminology used by professionals that is often difficult for outsiders to understand. It is by definition inaccessible to the average person. In a writing context, that means two things. First, by leaving it ambiguous, it can let an author demonstrate a character's technical know-how, without having to go into detail on what they're actually doing. If the jargon is particularly difficult to understand, that fact can be leaned into to highlight the complexity of the task. On the other hand, if it makes some amount of sense, it helps the audience understand that something technical is being done without needing to know the details. The phrase "reverse the polarity" is something of a get-out-of-jail-free card in sci-fi, but it serves its purpose. The machine is doing something, and it's not working, so reverse it and it will work the other way. Good enough when resolving the technical problem isn't the most important part of the scene. Secondly, when the jargon is intuitive or does make sense once explained, it immerses the audience. The feeling of understanding is satisfying, and will lead to getting invested in learning more. In cyberpunk, using wetware to refer to the still biological parts of a person as opposed to their cyberware is intuitive enough that the audience can understand the new term without explanation. Most people will have heard the term hardware before, even if they don't have a clear definition and can extrapolate from there. This is a good approach. Most real-life jargon makes sense with an explanation. After all, these are simply technical terms. They aren't meant to be difficult to understand. They're just specialist knowledge that most people won't know because they don't need to. Where and when jargon is used in sci-fi or fantasy works much like in other fiction. A character who always uses very technical language will come across as intelligent, but also often be perceived as lacking in social skills. Someone using jargon confidently yet incorrectly will look pretentious. The right jargon can be used to make an otherwise dry explanation a little more humorous. Real-life biology has plenty of funny terms like the sonic hedgehog protein and the related potential inhibitor robotnikinin. An author shouldn't need to worry about non-serious terms having to be used in a scene later. Walkie-talkies have a ridiculous name when you think about it, but no one notices when a soldier or security guard is using one. A final way to make use of jargon is to grant personality to a field of study. If you want to make the engineers on your spaceship seem very serious while the navigators are more laid back, make the engineering jargon difficult and opaque, while the navigation jargon is full of puns and literal meaning. In some ways, what jargon is to a profession, sayings and idioms are to a culture. They are terms and phrases that make sense to the people who know them, but not to anyone else. Their potential for world-building, however, is much greater. While a technical term is often just a little-known name for something, a saying has to come from somewhere and refer to something. Popular sayings are quotes from well-known works, references to past events, or turns of phrase particular to a culture. This makes them a great tool both for giving character to a culture and for exposition. A fantasy equivalent of all roads lead to Rome, for example, is a quick way to introduce a location and say something about it. If an author wants to characterize a culture as very down-to-earth or practical, their sayings will reflect that. Straightforward sayings and idioms that are simple in their explanation will give off a very different impression than flowery language or convoluted metaphor. The real-life saying, "there's more than one way to skin a cat," has a different tone to having more than one trick up your sleeve. The choice of what objects, creatures, or people a fictional culture has sayings about can inform what they value and what they regularly interact with. The game Caves of Qud takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where drinkable water is scarce. A common saying in this world is "live and drink." Used as a way to say goodbye, it works extremely well. Without any context, you can infer that the world is probably dangerous, and that some form of drink is important to this culture. Through playing the game, you quickly learn quite how dangerous the world is, and that water is so precious it's used as currency. The game then also has a few variations and different endings to the saying. "Live and drink water sibling," "live and drink friend," and "live and remain ever ruthless" are just a few of the examples. This does double duty of forming both a unifying culture for the entire region and also highlighting either the disposition of the person saying it or their local customs. Tying the sayings into the world is the most important part here. The real-world saying "flying too close to the sun" could in theory work without any backstory. Everyone knows the sun is very bright and hot, so even without modern knowledge, you can assume getting too close to it is a bad idea. But lots of things are bad ideas and don't become sayings. It's only with the context of the story of Icarus that the idiom makes sense as a warning not to become overambitious or careless. In George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, we have the phrase "and now his watch is ended," commemorating someone's death. Outside of context, this works well enough. Someone having been on watch and now it being over will draw up some imagery of a soldier or guard. It serves just fine as a way to honor someone's death. In the context of the books, however, it means much more. The knowledge of a Night's Watch as an organization and the fact that the position is supposed to be permanent adds far more weight to the line. They serve until death, and now that they have passed on, their watch is finally ended and they may rest. Far more impactful. Where sayings and idioms may characterize a culture across a whole nation or more, slang tends to be significantly more local, or particular to only a small subset of people. In some ways, this gives it even greater power for characterization. While an idiom will say something about the culture a character grew up in, or the history of their homeland, slang tells the audience about who they are now and who they're involved with in the present. Slang is in an interesting position linguistically. There's really no rules as to how slang is constructed or what a word means. Any word can take on any additional meaning as a euphemism or synonym for something. And any collection of sounds can become a slang phrase as long as a group of people all decide it means something. This makes it a lot easier in fiction to come up with slang terms. They only barely have to sound believable and are usually very easy to figure out from context clues. There's rarely a need to explain slang unless it refers to something fictional. But that can also be a trap, because it's so easy to make up, it's easy to go overboard. Past a certain point, too many made-up words becomes indecipherable. The show Cyberpunk Edgerunners takes a relatively sparse approach to slang, but uses it to great effect. A handful of terms, used often, help to cement the identity of Night City, and characterizes our main cast who use it often and those they interact with, like the corporate employees who don't. The terms used are all simple and fairly self-explanatory. The mix of how easy they are to understand while still leaning into the technological aspects of a cyberpunk setting make them feel natural. Using, for example, delta to mean leaving or short-circuit to mean crazy. A few examples like preem as short for premium, nova meaning cool, and corpo referring to a corporate employee may as well be real slang for how close they are to how people actually talk. And even the terms that don't have a clear comparison, like gonk for calling someone stupid or choomed for friend, are simple, sound right, and can be easily figured out from context. The thing to consider when making up slang is that it will almost always refer to extremely common things. These are terms for a group to talk about something that comes up a lot in a way that expresses their own culture. A part of that also means that the words chosen when referring to others will likely reflect their feelings about them. The one thing that all forms of new language in fiction struggle with is familiarity. If a term has been made up for a story or is being used in a new way, the audience has to learn it and adjust to it. While that's true for everything original to the story, new words in particular can struggle from a lack of reference. Someone reading a fantasy novel will probably have some idea that magic can do things beyond the laws of physics, and the details will be explained along the way. Working an explanation for every piece of slang and every turn of phrase into the text is unwieldy. The whole purpose of these is to quickly convey information. Making mountains out of molehills, or blowing things out of proportion, conveys a lot more tone and emotion than simply "you're exaggerating." A slight alteration to a real-life phrase can achieve the intended effect while maintaining familiarity. Various phrases referring to animals can be changed to use a fictional creature quite easily. "Now the fairy's out of the bag," or "don't count your dragons before they've hatched." Notably, these examples usually work better with a humorous or light-hearted story. The small nod to reality can break immersion and tone, since it's essentially an in-joke between the audience and author that the characters are not in on. No turn of phrase is universal either, even within a culture or region. Using names from real-life places is already an existing tactic to make fictional locations feel different, especially if they draw from the corresponding real-life culture in their design. The same thing can be done with language and manner of speaking. When doing so, it's important to consider that these are real people and you want to be aware of how they're being represented and whether the cultural aspects being used are actually real. It is pretty much impossible to discuss fictional languages, especially in fantasy, without addressing the elephant in the room: the multiple languages, language families, fictional scripts, and entire in-universe linguistic history of the world of Middle-earth by J.R.R. Tolkien. I feel it's important to say upfront that you do not need to by any means invent an entire language in order to have a fictional language in a story. Making up a handful of words to sprinkle in will do just fine. Just like coming up with a fictional history, there is a line where the project becomes about the language or history first and anything else second. It comes up a lot in conversation about Tolkien's work that he was a scholar of linguistics, and that passion for languages drove a lot of what he did. It certainly paid off, considering that over half a century later, people still study the world of Middle-earth, and there are scholars of Tolkien's fictional languages. All that said, conlangs, or constructed languages, are a fascinating subject with many uses. For world building, the simple act of attempting to create one can lead to a huge amount of added depth. The practical considerations of what phonemes, the sounds that make up letters, to pick and making letters and a script are only one part of it. You then need to decide what words actually exist, and if a language is part of a world rather than an isolated project, those words need to make sense in the world. What exactly do they mean? Are there synonyms? Is the word constructed from other words, and how do people use it? Deciding all of that is almost impossible without thinking about the people who would speak this language and their culture and history that led to the word's existence. The word nightmare, for example, has nothing to do with horses. It refers to the Middle English term mare, a type of evil spirit believed to sit on people in their sleep and suffocate them. Many words have similarly interesting stories. Developing these for a conlang can create some of the deepest and most cohesive worlds in fiction. After that, it's a matter of presenting them to an audience who doesn't speak the new language in a way they'll understand. In Tolkien's case, he framed the Lord of the Rings novels as English translations of the original texts. From tone to character building to exposition, fictional languages lend themselves to a multitude of purposes. The way we speak is crucial for conveying ideas. A few word choices can completely change the tone, emotion, and implied meaning of a message. Working only through text loses the advantages of tone of voice, facial expression, and body language. And even with these, someone with a different understanding could still interpret the words differently. Adding new words to a fictional world adds an extra layer of understanding. The reader learns these words from the character's perspective, and so learns what they mean to them and what the intent when they're used is. The added depth and authenticity provided by just a few sayings in slang terms really helps to make a fantasy world stand out. It's important, however, not to go overboard. Most readers have a limit for how many new words they're willing to learn, and almost no one enjoys it when you start replacing existing words just for the sake of being different. A light touch and a bit of originality are the best bet. Just a few words and phrases can make a fictional world feel truly different from any place on Earth.